famous trumpet man from out Chicago way. He had a boogie style that no one else could play. He was the top man at his craft. But then his number came up and he was gone with the draft. He's in the army now, a blowin' reveille. He's the boogie woogie bugle boy of Company B. They made him blow a bugle for his Uncle Sam. It really brought him down because he couldn't jam. The captain seemed to understand, because the next day the cap went out and drafted a band. And now the company jumps when he plays reveille. He's the boogie woogie bugle boy of Company B. A toot, a toot, a tooty blows it eight to the bar. In boogie rhythm, you can't blow a note unless the bass and guitar is playing with him. He makes a company jump when he plays reveille.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our new episode of our favorite show. So today we talk about modernism in Europe. This is an age where there is a crisis of certainties. The First World War left Britain in a disillusioned and cynical mood. Some soldiers celebrated their return home with a frantic search for pleasures. Others were haunted by a sense of guilt for the horrors of war. Or also other soldiers missed the sense of purpose that the war years had given them. Also, there was a gap between the generation of the young and the older one, because the older one was felt and regarded as responsible for the terrible waste of lives during the war. This increasing feeling of ruthlessness and frustration grew more and more, and this was due also to the slow dissolution of the Empire of the Commonwealth. This also led to a transformation of the notion of imperial hegemony and white superiority. In this time, writers like Edward Morgan Foster became averse to political subjection, and also was shaping the personal relationships on a sense of equality and feeling, and not about the belonging of a certain social class. Other writers, committed writers like George Orwell, warn their readers against the danger of totalitarianism. Nothing seems to be right or certain in this age. Scientists and philosophers destroy the old, predictable universe which has sustained the Victorians, because in the Victorian time there was this optimistic outlook, and so these new views of man and the universe that had emerged at the beginning of the century spread through society. Modernism expresses the modern consciousness and the modern experience through metaphorical discourse. It's a highly aesthetical response to an age marked by the disruption, catastrophe, and insecurity caused by war. It's a response to the new intellectual and philosophical debates dominated by Marx, Freud, Darwin, and Einstein. And it reacts to all these new concepts and offers a radical vision of man that is alienated from society. It's a vision that it's the opposite of the romantic ideal of man that was at the center of the universe, because in the romantic time, man was considered as the center of the universe. It was complex but well-defined individual, and he had the power to find and to fight and to change his universe. Ideally, the romantic universe was harmonious, and also there was a relationship with it. And there was also the physical and psychological manifestation of nature that was central in the Romanticism. For the modernist, man was no longer a unified individual, but a divided consciousness, an irrational being, and also unreliable entity. Um, the universe too was subjective, and it was dominated by a combination of subjective personal impression, economic laws, and biological tendencies that determine reality. Reality itself was not a fixed certainty, but a series of fragments or viewpoints that exist in a state of flux. Modernism is a complex movement which started after 1910 and flourished also in the 20s and the 30s, and which involved all forms of art, from literature and music to the visual arts and cinema. It started like an avant garde movement of an intellectual minority, but it achieved mainstream acceptance and had a huge influence of culture and popular entertainment over the course of all the 20th century. The events of the First World War, in particular, caused a sense of instability, and traditional values like patriotism, identity, and faith started to face in the face of such violence and destruction. This left people with a sense of distrust and without a clear reference point. So the artist felt alone and misunderstood, and what the artist wants to discover is not anymore outside but inside himself. So the inner self is the new land to discover. The term modernism includes a wide variety of approaches and attitudes to the representation of the modern world and the place of man into this modern world. For some authors, there's a complicity with modernity, but for others, there's an aptitude that is more skeptical. One thing that all the artists have in common during modernism is the desire to make a clean break with the tradition, uh, with all that came before them. And this is through experimentation with form and different style. Traditional form of narration and representation are rejected. Modern novels represent more the unconscious. The narration is fragmentary and relative, with a subjective perception of reality. The idea that there's only one truth or explanation is rejected. Literature in this time was widely influenced by the philosopher Henry Bergson, who elaborated the philosophical position in contrast with the scientific materialism and positivism which had dominated the Victorian period. For Bergson, time cannot be measured according to units. Uh, Units means minutes, hours, days, months, and so on. And this is because time is a flow, a duration, and not a series of points. So we don't experience the world and the time moment by moment, but in a continuous way. In the same way that we don't hear music note by note, but as a melody that flows. So this makes that the perception of time is not linear, but a mixture of past, present, and future, like different music instruments that play together in a song. In literature, this was reflected with a break of traditional linear narrative. Another element which influenced literature was the impact of the beginning of mass culture. This started because the reform of education that started in the late 19th century increased the level of general culture of the population. So there was a demand for popular literature that was accessible to everyone. Also, with the invention of radio and cinema, the idea of mass culture was born. For the intellectual, this was seen as a degeneration of cultural values, and they responded by creating self consciously difficult avant garde. So their works could be appreciated and understood only by a small elite of intellectuals. Another very important figure for the development of modernism was Sigmund Freud, with a series of human unconsciousness as multi-layered and different level of experience and memory. Freud's theories were first published in his famous essay, The Interpretation of Dreams, published in 1900. Freud's view of the developing psyche emphasizes the power of the unconscious to affect behavior. The discovery that man action could be motivated by irrational forces of which he might know nothing was very disturbing for the mentality of the time. His theory also plays enormous importance on the demand of the libido, particularly or those manifesting the Oedipus phase, so a libido attributed to children. Um, in the Oedipus phase, we know that the child sees the father as a rival for his mother affections. So this made a strong effect in the sphere of family. The relationship between parents and children were altered. The Freudian concept of infantile sexuality focused the attention of the importance of early development. So after centuries that they were not talking about that, since the philosopher Rousseau, childhood regained a status as a very important moment in the development of someone. Um, Also, Freud provided a new method of investigation of the human mind through the analysis of dreams and the concept of free association. Um, uh, his patients were invited to speak about whatever it entered in their mind at the moment. And this deeply influenced the writers of the modern age. If we think, for example, of the stream of consciousness, this is one example, and this was deeply influenced by Freud and also by the philosopher William James. Freud created a new structural model of the psyche made of three parts: id, ego, and superego. The id is a primitive and instinctive component of personality. It consists of all the inherited, so the biological components of personality present at birth, including the sex, life instinct, eros, which contains the libido, and the aggressive, so the death instinct, that is thanatos. The id is the impulsive and unconscious part of our psyche, which responds directly and immediately to basic urges, needs, and desires. The id remains infantile and in all its functions, and it stays like this all through all the life of a person. It doesn't change with the time or experience, and is not in touch with the external world. The id is not affected by reality, by logic, by the everyday world, because it operates within the unconscious part of the mind. The id operates on the pleasure principle. which is the idea that every wishful impulse should be satisfied immediately, regardless of the consequences. And all this, of course, is primitive, illogical, irrational, and selfish. The ego is that part of the id which has been modified by the direct influence of the external world. The ego develops to mediate between the unrealistic id and the external real world. It is the decision making component of personality. Ideally, the ego works by reason, whereas the id is chaotic and unreasonable. The ego often compromises or postpones satisfaction to avoid negative consequences of society. It considers social reality and norms, etiquette and rules in deciding how to behave. Like the id, the ego seeks pleasure and avoids pain. But unlike the id, the ego is concerned with devising a realistic strategy to obtain pleasure. The ego has no concept of right or wrong. Something is good simply if it achieves its end, or as if it satisfies without causing harm to itself. But often the ego is weak and the id is very strong. Um, Freud made the analogy of the id being a horse, while the ego is the rider. So the rider and so the ego has to check the superior strength of the horse, which is the id. Then we have the superego, which incorporates the values and morals of society, which are learned from our parents or from others, and it develops around the age of between 3 and 5 years old. The superego function is to control the id impulses, especially those with that society forbids, such as sex or aggression. It also has the function of persuading the ego to turn to moralistic goals rather than simply realistic ones, and to strive for perfection. Uh, the conscience can punish the ego through causing a sense of guilt. So these are the basic principles of the Freud philosophy. I'm sure that you studied that already in philosophy, so we don't need to go deeper. So we conclude here this episode, and let's see you for the next one. See you soon. Bye.